So I just want to welcome everyone here to the February 2023 New York Open Statistical Programming Meetup. We are clearly back to being virtual this month. We are going to work on going virtual in a hybrid, depending month to month, depending on our ability to find speakers geographically and finding venues to host us. That's obviously a bigger geographic constraint. So welcome to the virtual one. It is nice that we have the virtual option now to be able to go some months virtual, some months in person. So the very first thing we're going to do is ask about jobs. If you're hiring or you're looking for a job, we obviously can't all jump in and announce it up here. So go to the NYHackR Slack and we can put the link into the chat and go to the NYHackR Slack and post your jobs there. That's the best option for you right now to go get a job. And over the years, over the decades, we have gotten many people jobs simply by someone standing up and saying whether or not you are hiring. And people have found great employees and employees have found great employers. So it's really nice that having this opportunity. So please, if you have a job, go to NYHackR, the Slack channel, or if you go to nyhackr.org, you can find the Slack channel and go to the job postings channel and let us know about your job. Since I am on camera, I am hiring for both part-time and full-time, data scientists, data engineers, and sales, whether you call it an account executive or business development or sales, whatever you like to call it. We want someone to work with customers to help them out. All right, so everyone has a job is going to go to nyhackr.org, find the Slack channel, and post a job. Next up, pizza. We do this in person, we get to order pizza for you. So my pizza tonight, it's been sitting in my house for about 25 minutes, so it's already, the cheese is congealed. So you see this pizza right here? That's the crust for the underside. Good cheese lock, because A, it has good cheese lock, but B, it's been sitting around. So tonight, this is from Jet's Pizza. Some of you may know Jet's Pizza is a regionally famous pizza chain from Detroit. And they've opened a few outposts in New York City. So I've taken tonight's opportunity to have this Detroit-style pizza, which is having a real moment right now in the pizza scene, and enjoying that here. This is in honor of Jeff Ryan of XTS fame and Adam Hogan of the IR New York T-shirts fame. So thank you to both of those. They're both from Chicago and they love Detroit-style pizza and turned me on to Jets. So everyone else, let us know where you're getting pizza from. I see there's already a few fans of Jets in the chat there. That's great. I'm glad everyone loves Jets. I'm a big fan of the place, especially that garlic dip. It's a great place. It's really tasty. So everyone else, did you get pizza or did you get some other food? Let us know in the chat where you're eating from. Food is a big part of this meetup, so let us know. While people are letting us know, I will just do a few more announcements. We have a few conferences coming up that this community is probably excited about. Brownies, nice. Brownies from California, cool. Well, enjoying them. So enjoy your brownies. So a few conferences coming up in the next few months. There is Data Council taking place in Austin. That's March 28th through 30th. If you want to buy a ticket for that, you can use code NYOpenStat20. It's in camel case. I don't know if it's case sensitive. We will send that to the chat. Oh, I see Nicole already put that into the chat. You go to datacouncil.ai/Austin. You can check out the conference. Also coming up in a few months, April 19th through 21st is D4Con in Tampa. That's going to be taking place both virtually and in person. And you can use code NYHackR to get 20% off. That's the same discount code you get for as often as we can. We try to use that code, get people to use that code. Nicole just posted it in the chat. NYHackR for a 20% discount. Go to d4con.io to learn more about that conference taking place April 19th through 21st. And at the end of this meetup, after David's talk, after the questions, we are going to give away a free ticket to each of those conferences to someone who is attending tonight. Don't worry if you're not here when I say your name, we will contact you, but I'll announce your name. If you're present, we'll give you a virtual golf clap. If you're not present, we will be in touch with you to give you your free ticket. So at the end of David's talk, after the questions, you'll get a free ticket. I'll tell you what, we're going to give a free ticket to each randomly. And to whoever asks the best, as determined by me, question of David, you'll also get a free ticket to D4Con. All right, and David can help me figure out who gets the best question. We'll figure it out some subjective way, I'm sure. Also, conferences, we all know and love NYR. NYR, we have an announcement about that coming up really soon. The plans are almost finalized. So we'll let you know about NYR coming up in a week or two. Hopefully we'll have all the details ironed out and we'll be able to tell you all about that. I'm really excited. I see a few more things in talking about what they're eating: liver and onions with parsley in Raleigh. All right. And then we have best cheeseless pizza in the Rockies, Home Slice in Durango. Now, Home Slice in Durango, is that related to Home Slice in Austin? Because in Austin, the Home Slice is amazing. I don't know about the one in Durango. So if it is, let me know, because I'd love to see that. All right. So someone's asking about, do we have a list of conferences throughout the year that I recommend? Well, of course, Data Council coming up. I recommend D4Con in Tampa, NYR, which will be announced very soon. RGov, if you're in government, I'm wearing the shirt right now, is coming up later this year. We'll have announcements about that. Our POSIT conference coming up, ODSC, lots of good conferences. And we try to put these things out in our email blast. As they come up, we get discount codes from various conferences. We'll try to send them out to you as soon as possible. And like Nicole said, sign up for, if you remember the meetup, you should be getting the emails. Make sure you're registered for the emails, or follow rStatsAI on Twitter to find out more. The meetup for the next few months. We have speakers lined up for March and April, but we don't necessarily have a venue to host us. And the speakers are New York City based. So please, folks, if you have office space in New York, could be conference room, an auditorium, could be anything, let us know. Contact me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, go to jaredlander.com/contact, message us on Slack, the NYHackR Slack. Anyway, if you have space to give us, let us know, and we'll be very, very happy to host the meetup in your space. So anyone who has space in New York City, it could be Midtown, it could be downtown, it could be anywhere in between, right? Let me know, and we will host it there. So please let me know. In May, we have the inverse problem. We have a space, but no speaker lined up quite yet. So if you're going to be in New York City in May, or you live in New York City in May, and you want to give a talk, let me know, because we have the venue lined up, but we just need to have a speaker for it. So be in touch with me. Let me know if you want to give a talk and you're around in May. So, that's the way this meetup works. Either someone says, I want to give a talk, or I randomly call on them to give a talk. It can go any direction. It does happen. In fact, that's how David's here. I said, hey, you're giving a talk this month. He said, cool. I asked him. I gave him the courtesy of asking. Other people asked. Yes. So if you want to chat about the meetup, because actually there's going to be like a Q&A at the end, which there always is, but especially today. If you want to be a part of this Q&A, post the messages, preferably in our NYHackR Slack instead of Zoom. Because I said this before, I cannot copy and paste from the Zoom chat. I don't know what's wrong. I have tried on 2 different computers. So go to NYHackR. Plus also the NYHackR Slack is better because it's part of the community. It's not ephemeral like the chat here. It'll be in the community. People can reference it at least for another 90 days until the free tier Zoom takes it away. So if you're looking for that, I think Nicole just put a link to the NYHackR Slack. Go in there. And beyond tonight, you can ask questions about R, Python, Julia, SQL, Git. There's channels for all of that. There's an events channel where we try to put interesting events, both ran by us and ran by other people in the community. So go there, check that out. I think it's a very good resource. And that goes also with our website, nyhackr.org. If you go there, you will see there is 13 years, I was looking at the date, 13 years worth of talks up there, a slideshow for every single talk that we've ever had, and videos for at least half of them. We didn't start recording until a few years into the meetup. So that's a really great resource for learning about so much stuff. So lots of stuff for you folks to look at: conferences, meetups, pizza, or other food, and be sure to chat. So when David agreed willingly to come talk at this meetup, I was really excited because I thought he's spoken at our conference, our New York R conference, and our R government conference a few times. And I thought he had spoken at the meetup back in like 2009. It turns out, despite coming to the meetup back in 2009 and in the years since, he has never actually given a talk here. And I was shocked when I found this out, because how has he not given a talk at this meetup? He was using R before it was called R. That's how much of a hipster he is. He wrote the book. Oh, hold on, wait a minute. I have it right here. He wrote this book, An Introduction to R.
With a few other people.
with Bill Venables, a legend in the community. And I will say, I got both of them to autograph this. Now, there's actually a story behind this autograph. I asked Max Kuhn and David to bring a copy to Bill Venables and get it autographed for me. Only one of them came back. So I'm still waiting for the other copy. That's why I did things. I had a redundancy to make sure I got a copy. So I'm very happy that I have this copy of this book, because this means a lot to me having both these authors sign it. So I'm very happy about that. So thank you, David, for signing. Seriously, this is a great book. So folks, maybe later he'll tell you. If he doesn't, I'll explain how he's used R before it was called R. So I'm shocked he's never spoken at this meetup, but I'm glad we have this longtime member. He's wearing one of our NYC Data Mafia t-shirts. Yep, there it is. Because he is a longtime friend of this community, particularly a friend of this meetup. So everyone, please welcome David Smith.
Thank you, Jared. It is awesome to be here. Yeah, thank you so much for being here. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I could have sworn that I had spoken at that meetup before, because I do have the t-shirt. But I'm so glad we get to rectify that situation here and now. Today, I'm going to talk about Copilot, and specifically using Copilot for R. And if you haven't heard about Copilot or don't know much about it, don't worry, because I will talk about what Copilot is, what it does, and how you can use it. And even if you do know all about Copilot, I'm going to go behind the scenes in this talk in quite a bit of depth about how Copilot works, and specifically how it uses generative AI to produce the results that it does, and talk a little bit about how generative AI works. So with that, let me go ahead and jump right in. Hopefully my slides will progress if I click the button. There we go. All right. So for those of you that haven't heard of GitHub Copilot before, it is a service provided by GitHub, the same place you go to save all your source code and collaborate with other developers. And it's kind of like an AI pair programmer that sits there and works with you as you're typing code. It looks at the context of the code that you're actively developing, the comments around it, the lines of code around it, even things like the other files that you have in your project, and uses that information to suggest the next step in your coding practice. So the example here comes from the marketing team at GitHub. It is a TypeScript example. You can see that somebody has started to write a function in TypeScript, and then suddenly Copilot suggests an entire implementation of that function based on its name, based on the arguments, and just around the general context of that particular example right there. Now, Copilot is one of those things that is much easier to understand if you can see it in action rather than just seeing a static slide like this. So I have prepared a demo, which I'll show you in just a second. But before I get to that, when you're using Copilot, you are using it within an editor environment. I use Visual Studio Code all the time, so I'll be demonstrating it within VS Code. But you can also use it within JetBrains, within Visual Studio, the commercial version, and also within, what's that last one called? I can't remember. I'll come back to it. But like I said, I use Visual Studio Code, so that's what you're going to see in this demo. And if you're using Visual Studio Code and you want to install it and get started with the Copilot, there's a great link on your screen right there that you can use to get started. And I'll share that link at the end of this talk, along with a whole bunch of other resources that are available in the GitHub repository you can see on the bottom left-hand side of most of these slides. All right, so let's have a look at GitHub Copilot in action. I do have a recorded demo here, and you can actually see that in the GitHub repository as well. And I have a recorded repository, a recorded version of this demo, because GitHub Copilot, like most generative AI systems, is not deterministic. It gives different results every time. So you got to be pretty brave to give a demo with it, because it might do things that you don't expect. But I'm feeling brave today. So let's go ahead and do a live demo. And I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. And you can see I have Visual Studio Code open. I've got a blank R script open, and you can see I've got the R terminal already live down there at the bottom. So I'm going to start live coding right here. I'm going to do an analysis of a data set. It's called the Pumpkins data set. It's a data set that has information about various kinds of pumpkin sales, how much they sold for, what kind of packaging they are in, the quality, the location, all those usual things. And I'm going to try and build an analysis live with GitHub's help. So I'm going to use the tidyverse to prepare my data and do the analysis. Let's start off with library tidyverse. You can see Copilot was just helping me. That gray part you saw there was Copilot making the suggestions. You can see there's a little icon down here on the bottom right-hand side about Copilot. When that's spinning around, it's busy thinking about things to suggest. So let's start off with a comment. Read in the pumpkin data. Press enter. And in just a second, GitHub is proposing me a solution, which I could accept just simply by pressing tab. Now it's actually suggesting to read a file direct from a GitHub repository. And this is because this data set has been used in lots of tutorials and examples on the web. In fact, this particular data set comes from the ML for Beginners tutorial, which is available on GitHub. And there's a link in the talk notes for that. In this case, I've got a local file. So let's read in from that. Pumpkins takes the value, read _ CSV. And my file name is called US dash, oh, look. Copilot is actually selecting the file name because it has the context of my entire project to make suggestions like that. So let's go ahead and read in that. Data is read in. Now, if you have a look at the column names, oops, type properly here. You can see they've got spaces in them, and there's a couple of columns that don't even have names. That's a bit problematic for the analysis later on, so let's clean those up. Let's actually use the janitor package. And you can see it's making suggestions to use janitor there. And I just want something a little bit more simple than that. So I'm actually going to accept the whole thing and just use the clean names functions to clean up those names. Oops, I forgot to actually run library janitor there. There we go. And so now if I run names pumpkins again, we can see that the names have the spaces have been taken out. All right. What do we do when we analyze data? We look at the data. Let's perhaps look at display 5 random rows for fun. All right, GitHub is using the context there to actually use the sample _n function in a tidyverse kind of a way. And now we can see 5 random rows from the data set. The locations are like Columbia and New York. The varieties are 36-inch boxed and a 1 1/9 bushel package, all sorts of things. We've got some prices there, the low price, the high price at which it was sold. And we'll use that information for the analysis. Have you seen this kind of thing before, Jared? Have you played around with Copilot at all in your work?
A little bit. When it first came out, I tried using it. It's pretty handy for like getting you like live scaffolding and boilerplate so far for me.
All right, cool. I caught you eating pizza, didn't I? That was my goal.
You totally did. That's why there was a pause.
Excellent. All right. All right. So now that we had a look at the data, let's do something a bit more complex. Let's create a table. Let's show the average high price by package. That's kind of the box that comes in and its color. Enter. GitHub thinks a minute. It gives a suggestion. The suggestion it's giving to me is pumpkins into a group by, into a summarize. That looks about right. I'll press tab to accept that, press enter. And there we go. We got back a table and we can see the 1 1/9 bushel cartons. In the orange color, the average high price was 16.2. Now, by the way, just going back to the way that GitHub is a bit Copilot rather, is a bit non-deterministic. A couple of times when I was practicing a demo, it actually passed it into knitr to generate a nicely formatted table for me. Didn't do it that time, but like I said, you never quite know exactly which solution it's going to give you. All right, so let's do some modeling. How about an analysis of variance of high price by price by, we've got the variables, we've got an origin. Let's do origin, color, and item size. Enter. GitHub is thinking for, Copilot is thinking for a minute, and you can see It's going to put into group by and summarize and alpha underscore test. That's actually not the function I want to use in this case. I want to use AOV. So let's guide it a little bit. Model AOV. You can see that coming up already. So we've got high price, origin, color, and item size. Notice that I didn't put the specific variable names in my comment there, but it's figure things out by context. Okay, that AOV is done. And now let's print out the analysis of variance table. Print AOV table. Okay, it's suggesting summary model. That's what I would use too. And there we go. We have the analysis of variance. The 3 variables are significant when it comes to the high price. And there's lots of other things we can do as well. We can do predictions, and it's really, really helpful in doing these suggestions. And I'll give you a bit of a confession. It's actually quite a while since I've actually done a statistical analysis of it. Most of these commands since I had last used them, but as I was developing this demo, Copilot was super helpful as actually suggesting idioms for me that I could use to do this analysis. So I hope that was a good example right there. Let me go back to my slides. All right. There's the demo in the slides, which you can find on the Copilot R website. So now that you've seen Copilot in action, let's talk a little bit about how it works. And behind the scenes, what's happening here is a generative AI model is being used to generate suggestions of code from prompts, which is the previous lines of code that you have in your script. But let's talk about this a little bit more generally. Now, you might have heard of a company called OpenAI. It's been very much in the news recently with things like ChatGPT. There are 3 models in particular that OpenAI has developed for generative AI. One is GPT-3, which is based around text. The prompts you give it have like pieces of text. The example here is write a tagline for an ice cream shop. And one response that it might generate for you from GPT-3 is, we serve up smiles with every scoop. You've probably heard about ChatGPT. It's been in the news a lot lately. And in fact, the new Bing uses something like ChatGPT in the background. That's also based on a similar kind of model, but a more advanced version. Another model that OpenAI has created is called Codex. And unlike GPT, which is basically trained on all the text in the web, Codex is trained on all of the open source code in GitHub. So it has lots and lots of examples of code from lots of different languages, including R, but also has things like all the README files and the data files and lots of context that helps it create responses to prompts like, create a SQL query for all the customers in Texas named Jane, query equals, and then the response that Codex would give back to that like that is a nice SQL query that does exactly what you've asked. Select star from customers where state equals TX and first name equals Jane. The other model you've probably heard about is DALL-E, which unlike the other 2, which operate on text, this one generates images from text. An example here is the prompt is a white Siamese cat, and then the response might be a picture of a Siamese cat. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not a web search type of a thing happening. It's actually generated that image on the fly, and that image most likely doesn't exist anywhere else on the web. It was generated when you asked for it by that prompt. There's lots to talk about these image generation models, but don't have time to talk about any of them today. So I'm going to focus on GPT-3 and Codex as we go forward. Now let's go. I'll come back to what I was about to say, but let me talk a little bit more about how generative AI models work. Everything starts with a prompt. You've seen a few examples just a minute ago, like generate a tagline for an ice cream shop, or that prompt might come from the pieces of code that Copilot is working from in that context. Whatever that prompt is, it gets passed into a generative AI model. Now, for now, just think of that as a black box. Input is the prompt. It gets passed into this black box model, and then the output is a completion or a continuation of that prompt. So in the case of GPT-3, that's some text that completes the first prompt you gave it. In the case of Codex, that's some code typically that completes the code that you provided for it. So that's the fundamentals of how these generative AI models work. Now, the way that they are built in the first place is with lots and lots of data and lots of training data. GPT-3, for example, it's a neural network with several billion parameters that was trained on literal zettabytes of data. Took months upon months to actually train this model. Millions of dollars of CPU hours to actually generate that black box at the end of the day. It's not something that people typically will do themselves, but companies like OpenAI have provided these neural networks that you can then pass in a prompt to generate a completion. But they are black boxes, and that implies some properties of those black boxes. First of all, let's have a look at what they can do. As we saw in a minute, these generative AI models can generate text, images, and code. And what they generate is really driven by what they are trained on in the first place. And now we're seeing things like specialized generative AI models that are trained on, for example, the medical literature. They're designed to generate medical information to help support people in the medical industry. The output that they generate, you might consider to be human-like. It looks like a human could have written it. And that's because it's trained on data that human has written, text and codes and so forth. But I want to emphasize the fact that it's only human-like. It's not a human action, though. It's really a probabilistic thing. Generate a likely continuation of the prompt that you gave me, conditional on the training data that I was trained with on the first place. And you've seen a lot of examples of people using generative AI like ChatGPT to extract information. Ask it a question, what was the 22nd president of the United States? And the continuation or the response that it gives you is likely to be correct because there's lots of information about the 22nd president of the United States in the web that it was trained on, and it's likely to give the correct answer to that. In that particular case, we'll have some caveats about that in a minute. But in addition to extracting information, these generative AI models create novel content. It's not just a copy of what it was trained upon. It's actually generating new text, new images, and new code that wasn't contained in its training set. And that has a lot of nice implications. For example, you can use it to do creative works, write me a poem, write me a letter, write me an essay. It will do those kinds of things. You can also do it for things like translations, like translate this bit of text from English into French. And that works because it has text from lots of languages in its training set. English is the most representative one because English is most represented on the web. So it doesn't do so well in other languages, but those translations do work. So that's the things that it can do. Let's have a look at what it is not. I want to emphasize that generative AI is not intelligent. It has no intelligence. It does not think. It is really just a predictive system. We're all statisticians, data scientists, machine learning people. It really is just predict from my prompt what the most likely continuation is. And that's based, once again, upon its training data. We've seen already that it's not necessarily deterministic either. Unlike traditional machine learning models, there's not just one single prediction. What it actually generates is a whole series of potential predictions associated with their probabilities. And as we'll see a little bit later on, it doesn't just choose the most likely one. It actually randomly samples from the top, X%, depending on certain settings. So what that means is you can give it the same prompt twice and get a different response back each time, probably anyway. And one consequence of that is that these generative AI models are not trustworthy. It's not regurgitating a fact. It's not generating information for you. It's simply making predictions of what sequence of words best follows your prompt given the training data. And what that means in turn is it can hallucinate facts, especially when you give it a prompt that strongly suggests things that are not facts. You've probably seen a lot of example stories on the web of AI bots sort of getting into conversations or arguments with people. And that's because it's feeding on its own conversation, which is in turn is, say, argumentative. And that provides more. Start sort of talking about killer robots. It's probably because the prompt suggestion suggested something to do with that. And then it's drawing on sci-fi literature to continue its prompts because they're the most likely things to follow on with once you start talking about killer robots. Furthermore, generative AI does not learn. Remember, it's a black box. That model was fixed at the time of its training, and it never changes again. We'll see some examples of that in just a minute. Also, the black box does not contain all the information of its training set. And you can think about that quite simply in terms of the fact the internet is several yottabytes of data. But ChatGPT itself, or GPT-3, that's many, many gigabytes of data, but it's certainly way, way smaller than the internet itself. So in some sense, the information must be compressed down. There's a really good paper, not a paper, an article, in fact. It's for a lay audience, but I highly recommend it. It's called, if you search for the ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the web. There's a link in the talk notes, linked on this slide. It gives a really good sort of layman's explanation about what's going on with that compression process. But a good way to think of it is these models are a blurry JPEG of all the information that was in its training data. Now, the flip side to that is that these generative AI models do not include or contain verbatim copies of the information or the files that are in its training data. It can generate continuations from prompts that make it looks like it might, but oftentimes these are just random generations that look like the stuff that it was really trained on, or sometimes it does generate literal stuff that does exist somewhere else, but that's because it's very highly represented in the training data, or perhaps there's only one logical completion from the prompt that you provided. I want to re-emphasize these last points. Generative AI doesn't understand language. It's just a predictive engine. It doesn't understand math either. It doesn't learn the rules of mathematics. And often when you give it math problems like, what is 3,000 plus some random number, it'll get the answer wrong because it's never seen that particular sequence of characters in its training set. By the same token, generative AI doesn't understand facts. It might look like it does because the predictions, the completions, echo information in the training set, but that's by far and away not guaranteed. Generative AI doesn't understand manners. It doesn't understand emotion. It doesn't understand ethics. It doesn't understand anything. And it's one recommendation, it's really hard to avoid, but really try to avoid anthropomorphizing AI systems. Don't talk about them as he or she, or give them emotions or motives. It's just a predictive system based around a black box. All that being said, I've talked a lot about some of the downsides of generative AI. You can mitigate some of them with something called prompt engineering. And that can be an entire seminar on its own right. So I don't have enough time to really go into that, but just very briefly, you've got a lot of scope for providing information in that prompt. And in fact, in GPT-3, you can do more than 1,000 words in that prompt. So for example, you can give it a prompt like extract the mailing address from this email, copy it in an email, and see what it does. And with that context, it will actually scan the contents of that email, find the bit that looks like an address, and actually return the address back to you. And there are lots of other things you can do with those prompts. You can tell it a style to generate its response in, like respond in the style of Liam Neeson reciting a Valentine's poem. That's a fun one to do. And a lot of the, well, I'll say, we're going to be looking at using GPT-3 through the API in a minute. And as a programmer using the API, you're fully responsible for generating this prompt. But if you're using commercial services like ChatGPT or the new Bing, a lot of prompt engineering is happening behind the scenes that you don't see. What's being passed in that black box model is a lot of context, perhaps context from a web search or context from your previous chat history that might make it seem like the AI has memory or has emotions. But that's just a function of what's gone into its prompt, not of the AI model itself. All right, moving on there. So we've heard about OpenAI. You might not have heard that Microsoft has gone into a partnership with OpenAI to make its models available within the Azure service. So if you used OpenAI's GPT-3, that same model is now available with Azure, as is Codex, and as is DALL-E, although DALL-E is currently in preview. It's currently a little bit hard to get access to. There is a waiting list to get access to these APIs because demand is way exceeded supply on this. But these are exactly the same models now available through the Azure service, which gives you, all the Azure security, or you can use the same Azure billing that you use for everything else and combine it with all the other Azure services as well. And that, in fact, is what Copilot does. Behind the scenes, Copilot is using the OpenAI Codex model, which, as a reminder, is trained on lots and lots of open code from GitHub. And when you're typing in Visual Studio Code, what is happening is Visual Studio Code is providing context back to the Copilot service. So the lines of code around where you're typing and information about the files that you're working on and so forth. And then that is what is used to provide the suggestions, which then Visual Studio Code presents as a gray option to you in your file. You can press tab then to accept it. And by the way, when you do press tab to accept those suggestions, that information goes back to the Copilot service to improve future suggestions that it delivers to you as you're doing your coding. All right. So that's a lot of tirade about generative AI. I thought you might be interested to see generative AI in action and also to see it used from R. So I actually wrote some scripts and some functions to interface with the OpenAI service, and let's play around with those now. How are we doing on time, Jared?
We are pretty good, I'd say, because you've been at it for about, I'm trying to do basically 25 minutes, another 10, 15.
All right, okay. We got time for a few demos here in that case. So should be able to see my Visual Studio Code screen again up on the screen there. And what I have open here is an R script, which you can find in the GitHub repo. I'm going to use Hadley's new HTTR2 library to interface with the API. It has some nice features that allows me to build up the URLs for the endpoint. And also, because I am actually rate limited in my particular subscription, I actually use the rate limiting features to control the way I interact with the API service. But anyway, you'll need a key. If you're using Azure, you can get the key from the keys and endpoints section in your deployment. This script, by the way, will also work with the regular OpenAI service. So if you have an account with OpenAI, you can use the same scripts just with a different endpoint and a different key, of course. So I've extracted that endpoint out from my Azure subscription. And I've got several deployments in there, and each deployment is a different kind of model. I'm going to be working first with what is called DaVinci 3, and that's the same as GPT-3 in OpenAI. There are a few other models that we'll play around with, as we'll see when we get to them. Let's start with DaVinci 3 as the model. So first of all, I'm going to show you just how to manually set up an interaction with the API. First of all, you've got to define the URL, which is going to be the endpoint. So that's that basic endpoint I showed you, plus OpenAI/deployments. Then you add in the specific model that you're going for. So I've made that a parameter here. Then there's completions, because we're using the completions API to generate a completion from a prompt. And then there's the API version you need in there as well. So that defines my URL that I'm going to send a payload to. This is where I define the payload. There's lots of options here that control how GPT works. The main one that's of interest here is the one called prompt. In this case, I'm going to send hello world as a prompt to the GPT service. So let's define my payload, just as a little bit of a JSON in a string. Combine the endpoint and the payload together. And then rec.perform in Hadley's package is the one that actually sends it to the service. And then we can extract from the result the completion, $choices. That's where the actual prompt pops in. And it comes back here with, hello, my name is John Doe, and I'm new to this website. I'm interested in learning more about programming and technology. Any advice or tips will be greatly appreciated. Thank you. By the way, hello world turns out to be a really useful first prompt to send to the GPT service because it's really varied, the responses you get back. Even the lengths vary a lot. So if you want to try things out, hello world is a good place to start. But let's do something a little bit more interesting. So I've encapsulated all of that script that I just showed you into a function, which I've stored in a file called openai.r. Exactly the same code I just showed you with a little bit more error checking and so forth in there. So let's start off with some of the fun things. So let's ask OpenAI GPT-3 to tell me a joke. So I send that to the service. It comes back with, what did the fish say when it hit the wall? Damn, not a very good joke. Let's ask us to tell us a dad joke instead. Dad joke. Response. Question. What did the baby corns say to the mama corn? Answer. Where's popcorn? All right. Also a bad dad joke, but it's not its strength. Anyway, I want to show you some of those things we were talking about before about some of the problems that can occur with these models. If I ask OpenAI GPT-3, what is the date today? Today is August the 8th, 2020. That is obviously not true. So that demonstrates a couple of things. Remember, these models are black boxes, and this black box was frozen some time ago. So it has no idea what today's date is. So when you give it that prompt, it's got nothing to do except hallucinating essentially a response that makes sense in terms of English syntax, but certainly is not a fact. And by the same token, if I run that same prompt again, there is a very good chance I'm going to get a different result. And indeed I did. Today is June the 8th, 2020. So that demonstrates these models are frozen in time and they're non-deterministic. You can put in the same prompt to get different results. All right, we'll do some more with GPT-3 in a minute, but I wanted to look at a codex for a minute. So now the prompt I'm giving it is this one. Fibonacci takes the value function n, and everybody should be able to see that is I deliberately chose the less than minus arrow there for R because that gives it good guidance that I want R as a continuation to this. And the model I'm passing it into is now called Code DaVinci 002. And that is the codex model. So that's the same one that Copilot is using. So let's see what happens when we do this manually and prompt it directly. OpenAI Fibonacci is function n, and you can see what gets back is what you might expect somebody who is learning programming in R to code a recursive Fibonacci function as. And in fact, this particular example is set up to generate 1 to n Fibonacci numbers from that in the loop. When I run this differently, I get different responses. Sometimes it just generates 1 Fibonacci number. And I've even got some examples of calling that code down there at the bottom because it just keeps on continuing with what it thinks it might see. And it's obviously seen things like that in scripts before, probably tutorials teaching people how to run R. Let's have a look at another couple of examples with Codex. I'm going to prompt it with a comment, read data from a file, but that's all. And most likely this will not be R. And in fact, it looks like it's generated, is that Python? I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it's generated just some code in some language to read data from a file. So let's encourage a little bit more and give it 2 lines of input. Read data from a file, data arrow. So this is pretty clearly going to be an R response. And we can see some other CSV example. So you can see some examples of how Codex is actually generating those prompts with the Visual Studio Code. But Visual Studio Code provides back to the Copilot service a lot more context, which is what makes its prompts a lot better than these random type things that we're getting right here. Okay, moving on to a couple more examples, going back to GPT-3 again. That's the text example. Now let's ask it to write a limerick with the latest version of GPT-3. There once was a language called Python. It was crying to be trying. It had an interpreter to run your coder and a community that was flying. I get a different response every time for this one. It's usually a pretty decent limerick. This one rhymes. It's in the right meter. That's pretty good. But it's interesting to compare that with smaller and older versions of these generative AI models. If I use Text DaVinci 2, that's actually the same GPT model, but a much smaller neural network. And it runs faster. It's cheaper to run too. But if I run that one, you can see what we get back is, there once was a language called Python. Its syntax was simple and sweet, but it didn't matter because it was so slow that nobody ever used it. Obviously, a different type of limerick. It doesn't rhyme. It's not as factual. You can see the differences between using these simpler models. And in fact, we can even go to a previous generation of the GPT models. That's the Curie model, and see what it comes back with then. Wow, this isn't even a limerick. It's a poem with 4 lines. I'm not going to read all that. It doesn't rhyme. You get very different things from these older models as well. One of these days, I'm going to sync this up with that video from 2001, where the astronaut is pulling the bits out of Hal, and it's slowly degrading until it starts singing Daisy. Same kind of thing is happening here. Anyway. Last example, I want to talk a little bit about how prompts are generated, because I've been a bit loosey-goosey with how I've explained how it generates the responses, the continuations, and it can generate like a sentence or a paragraph or maybe just a word. But in fact, it does none of those things. It actually generates something called tokens. These are little parts of words typically. The reason for that is because what the model actually generates at the end of the day is not text. It's actually probabilities. For all the potential tokens it might generate, what are the probabilities that one of those is the next continuation of that prompt? And then it picks from the top few high probability things. It turns out that just choosing the highest probability every time doesn't work very well. We're not exactly sure why, but it produces very stale kind of text. But if you add a little bit of randomness, it actually looks a lot more human-like. So that's what people generally do. And that's the reason why it's tokens, is because it's not possible to assign a probability to every word in the world, especially when you start considering things like proper names, which could be just about anything. So by reducing that probability space just down to tokens, it's manageable, and it turns out to generate useful text at the end of the day. Let's play around with that a little bit. The prompt I'm giving it here is an unusual cat name is, and just to see what happens when it generates a sequence of tokens, Alonzo in this case. Let's just generate one token at a time. Max tokens equals 1. What do I get back? I get nothing because the first thing it actually responds is a new line after the prompt. If I generate 2 tokens, I get 2 new lines because it's the new line after the prompt and then a space. Once I get to 3 tokens, though, I get the first one. It's generated an M. M as a token. Let's try 2 tokens. Oh, it's generated Alaska. That's 2 tokens, Al and Aska. And you notice that they don't follow from each other because remember, once again, the black box has no memory. So when I generated the 4 tokens, it had no memory that it just generated an M previously. But we can simulate things like the API does by passing the generated token back into the prompt. So stick it on the end of the prompt, regenerate from that new prompt, and then iterate over that. And so we'll be able to see the process of it building up a response token by token. And this is one of the fun things about playing with these GPT models from R is you can programmatize, is that a word even? This kind of experimentation together. So anyway, Jared, this is your cue. Pick a letter for me between A and Z.
L.
L, okay. So just to show that this is happening dynamically, the prompt is an unusually long name for a cat is L. And I've included one letter there to make sure that the next token is in a new line. It's going to continue from the L. And then I'm going to loop through. I'm going to first of all ask for a completion of that prompt using the DaVinci 2 model in this case. Then I'm going to add the token it generates back to that prompt and then print out the results and then go back again. So we're continually cycling the generated single token back into the prompt and seeing the results. So let's actually go ahead and run this loop and see what happens. All right, this is a good one. So you can see it generating things prompt by token by token. The first token was ULU. The next token was space Von. The next token was space FL, then UFF, then EN, then bottom, and then it doesn't generate any more new tokens after that. So it's generated an unusually long time for a cat is Lulu, Von, Fluffinbottom. And it's fun to try with the different starting letters to see what you get there. But I just want to show you a little bit about what's happening behind the scenes when the AI models are actually generating the results token by token and choosing them randomly, which is what gives it the variety and the human-like nature of its results. All right, that's it for the demo. Let's do a wrap up. All right, so we're seeing GitHub Copilot in action. You can use it from within Visual Studio Code. And by the way, the Visual Studio team has done lots of analysis of people using Copilot. They found for those people that have Copilot installed, 40% of the code that they write is actually generated by Copilot for them. So it's saving them a lot of time. But more importantly, it means that as you're programming, you can spend more time, actually thinking about problems and thinking at a higher level rather with the details of APIs or looking up code. And so 75% of the developers they surveyed felt more fulfilled with their jobs using Copilot, and 87% of them said it helped preserve their mental effort. Unfortunately, though, Copilot is not free. It is a subscription service of GitHub. It's $10 a month for individuals and $19 a month for workers within businesses. And you can find the details around that at the GitHub website, of course. Lastly, we also saw the OpenAI service. This is a new implementation of the OpenAI models within Azure, directly within your Azure subscription, the same security, the same models, using the same billing system. And it really makes it easy to integrate these GPT models into applications that you build within the Azure system. And as we saw, you can get access to that from any programming language, including R. So that's it for the presentation. Once again, if you would like to get access to Copilot within Visual Studio Code, just use that link I have there, right there, aka.ms/getpilot. I provide all the demos, scripts, information, resources, links associated with this talk on GitHub at the link that you see on the screen right there. It's been a pleasure doing this for you. You can always find me on Twitter. And if you have any feedback or questions, feel free to ask them now. And if you don't get a chance right now because you're watching this on a recording, feel free to drop an issue into the GitHub repository and I will follow up from there. All right, thanks for that. And I'll hand it back to you, Jared.
Thank you very much, David. Now we all gave him a round of golf applause, but I just want to say thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. So thank you very much for giving your first ever NY Hackard talk.
It's hard to believe.
Yep, I know. When I see this, I'm like, oh, I was going to say David gave a talk in 2009. It didn't happen though. Yeah. So I'm glad you finally gave it. I'm glad it's finally happened. So the first question I saw asked was, can we use Copilot in our studio?
Unfortunately, you cannot. Copilot doesn't yet have an API for other editors to plug into. It's just the 4 editors that I showed you on the screen before. And I remember what the last one was. It's NeoVim.
NeoVim.
Thank you.
I was waiting to tell you that. Yeah. I haven't actually used NeoVim myself, but I've heard so many people say I should use it instead of Vim. But to be honest, most of the time, Vim and remote. One second, folks. Sorry. All right, buddy, listen.
I have never used NeoVim myself. I used VI once and then I couldn't escape from it. And then I swore it off ever since. So
we know that's the most asked question on Stack Overflow, how to exit Vim.
Right, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, David Robinson.
And the answer to that is stop using it forever.
Yes. So for folks that don't know, David wrote an extension or plugin called ESS, Emacs Speaks Statistics. So you can tell where he fell in the editor war. Because I was going to say that most of the time, if I'm on a remote server now, I try to use the VS Code shell into the remote server to use it.
Yeah.
So the next question we have
and in fact, I was doing that in the demo. People might have noticed that I was actually running all of that within Linux, with WSL, Windows Subsystem for Linux. And I was remoting over from my Windows desktop into that remote Linux, and everything just works fine.
Nice. And I've actually asked you a question about this before. I know, so you use WSL as your main development, and that's where you use Git and everything. So you don't really do anything on the Windows side.
Oh, except the user interface. I mean, I use PowerPoint, I use Outlook, all those kinds of things, and I like the windowing system. But in terms of if I'm coding, I'm using Bash or R. So I wouldn't be in Linux for that. Yeah.
All right. And then you use VS Code as your primary development environment.
Yes.
Okay. Well, give me 1 second. I'm going to try to remove the noisemaker for 1 second, folks. I'll be right back to ask more questions. I hope. Hey, mommy.
Yeah, and feel free to ask me questions about WSL if anybody has questions about that. Ever since that came out, it's made my Windows experience much, much nicer because I've never been comfortable using any of the Windows shell commands. I don't use PowerShell. I don't use CMD.
I actually have real respect for PowerShell. It's a completely different system than Bash.
It's like
object-oriented. It's supposed to be amazing. I never use it. Yeah. So we'll see how long I get until the little human comes back. There's a question. I'm going to rephrase the question a little bit. Have you found a way to sort of trick Copilot into using the native pipe instead of the Magritte pipe?
Oh, no, I haven't. But on the other hand, I haven't tried. I grew up with R way before there was even a tidyverse. So even the regular pipe is somewhat new to me. And that's what I use in all of my programming. So I expect Copilot has picked up on that from my own code. I suspect, I haven't tried this, that if I started using the native pipe, it would start echoing that back to me. And it also depends kind of how much data is out there in the training data with people using the native pipe, which would influence how often it does that as well.
That was what I was thinking, because I guess that actually leads to another question. How often is the model updated to capture more recent developments?
That is a good question. The answer is the underlying model itself, not very often. Like I mentioned earlier on, it is many months and many, many millions of dollars to retrain one of these models. That being said, there's a process called fine-tuning, which basically just retrains the upper layers of these models. So there are processes even available in the OpenAI service, both on Azure and in OpenAI, where you can provide a new corpus of data and then sort of retrain the upper layers of that model. So it will influence the way that it works. So that's one possibility. That's kind of left to the individual users, though. The Microsoft doesn't do that for people.
So it's like individualized. You could point it to your GitHub
That's
and make
right.
it really feel like you.
Yep, exactly. But that's, again, it is possible.
All right. Oh, so you can't just point it to GitHub. You actually need to go through and train.
Oh, no. You need to provide your new, or not your new training data, because it's built on the old model, but you essentially fine tune it with some additional training data. And that might be a company's kind of own knowledge base. And then people within a company, they can query that fine-tuned model and get answers that are specific to not just the base model itself, but also the new context, the new corpus that's been provided.
All right, that's cool.
Yeah.
Let's see. Where is this? All right. What are the licensing considerations, and can this be used for commercial work?
Absolutely. If we were talking about Copilot here, the code that is generated by Copilot is owned by you, the person that generated it. It's just think of it like the way you do a compiler. When you use a compiler on source code, the binaries that are generated by that compiler, you own those. The same thing applies to the code that's generated by Copilot. Now, that being said, remember all those things I said about how you can't really trust these generative AI models. They can be useful, but do verify them. And especially when it comes to code, do all the same things you usually do with respect to security and correctness, build tests around them, do penetration tests, all those kinds of things. You can't assume that code is going to be perfect because it's drawn from the training from the wealth of code that's out on the web, which itself is not perfect.
So are you going to have a George Box moment? All generative models are wrong, but some are useful.
Maybe I'll use that as a quote in the future.
Yeah. It's like quote by David Smith quoting George Box.
Yes.
All right. I think hopefully that becomes something. All right. The next question is, what have you found Copilot particularly good at or surprisingly good at? And what do you find it surprisingly bad at?
Good questions. The thing I find it surprisingly good at is surfacing idioms and functions and even libraries that I wasn't aware of. Like when I used that janitor function, I hadn't used the janitor library before, but I was doing some prompts around cleaning data, and one of them came up with this library janitor continuation. I was like, what's that all about? So I looked at it and then I used it. So it was like really useful to me to learn how to do things. Same thing with a lot of the transformations that we're doing in the data. Like I used to refer to, I think I have it here. I used to refer to the RStudio cheat sheets all the time. And now I don't need to, because it just tends to pop up as idioms for me as I'm programming. Things that it's bad at, when you start getting into complicated things or things that are slightly different than standard idioms, it tends to gravitate back towards the training data, what it's seen before. So sometimes you kind of feel like you're fighting against it a little bit to say, do the thing that I want to do, not what the rest of the world has done. And in those kind of situations, you can actually turn off the automatic prompts and just have it generate a prompt when you ask. And some people prefer to work like that. Just say, press a button, give me a prompt now, rather than with every keystroke I type.
Okay. And it can't do that right now.
No, you can. Yeah, that's an option within Visual Studio. I forget exactly what option it is, but you can make these say only generate a prompt when I ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wish you had done this. Maybe you have not. I'd like to see a comparison between the tidyverse code it generates and the data table code it generates.
Yeah, that would be a good example. And if anybody wants to try it out, drop us a line or put a pull request to some of the examples in the GitHub repo.
Or you could give a whole talk at this meetup about it if you got some cool stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't use data table. Performance has never been any of my concerns in any of my jobs I've worked in ever. So I much prefer readable code to performant code.
Now, before we start a fight about data table versus I have some great photos of a staunch tidyverse person, a staunch data table person at Rye House after one of the conferences arguing about this. It's one of my favorite moments. JD Long captured on photo. So thank you forever, JD, for doing that. So going with what you were saying, actually, about how it prompted you of janitor or things you haven't used before, there's a bit of a lengthy question. So I'll try to get the meat of it. When you showed the janitor, it figured out the column names for you.
Yeah.
And this person is asking, well, non-standard evaluation has historically caused problems for linting. So in the example, Copilot is making suggestions that name the column names, which are not objects in the environment and would not normally be syntactically valid outside of a call to a tidyverse function.
Mhm.
Saying which of these things are possible, and this is lengthy. I was first. I'll ask you before I ask his options. How is that possible? How did it figure out the column names without being able to look into the object?
Okay, so first of all, you're absolutely right. It's not looking into the object. It's not doing any active R evaluation whatsoever. And in fact, I'm pretty sure it doesn't get even any information about the R environment because Visual Studio Code isn't set up to send it back to Copilot. I think it might be for some other languages like Python, but I don't think it is for R. But remember, all it's doing is generating token by token things that look good, ultimately, based on what it's done before. So it might generate absolute nonsense. And you've got to be aware of that. I remember when I first played around with Copilot a couple of years ago now, and I played around with the penguins data. And I tweeted a little bit of a video of an example. And it wasn't until later that I realized that the variable names that it generated didn't even exist in the data. I think it was something like bill weight was one of the variables that it generated. There is no bill weight, I think, in the penguins data. But it just generated those things because bill is something related to penguins and weight was something related to the data. So it just generated that as a series of tokens. So you've got to be on the lookout to make sure that it's generating something that's useful to you. And quite often you'll need to go back and do some editing. I will confess that because I had been practicing a lot with this particular demo and Visual Studio Code was, as I mentioned earlier on, sending some of that information back to the Copilot service, for me, it was actually learning from what I had been doing before and using some variable names. So it was actually doing a lot better than it might do from a brand new setup.
So that learning is doing from you. It's just for you. Like I won't benefit from it learning about what you did.
No, it's just for me.
Okay. All right. Cool. All right. So your answer to this person's question, essentially, he gave three options what it could have been. One was looking at the data frame, which you said no. Reading from the console, and you said no about that. The third one is could have seen that this is a commonly used data set and it would have reached out, saw that been used before. But from your Palmer's Penguins example, no, it's just doing its best to generate tokens. Okay, that works. All right, cool. Then I will continue on to other questions. This is more of a getting started question. You sort of had a link at the end that covered this. The first part of this, how do you sign up for Copilot? And I think, get Copilot's right there. Your link's right
on the
there.
screen. Yep.
Yep. Then how did you get it inside VS Code working as with integrated into your console?
Actually, the same answer. That link there is a link to the extension in Visual Studio Code for Copilot. So once you've installed that in extension, it prompts for you to sign in GitHub and make sure you have that all set up. But the extension is the easiest way to start.
Okay. I hope that answers that question. Let me see if there's any other similar questions about that. Okay. You mentioned the generative killer robots, and we know that R is from New Zealand, where there's that song by Flight of the Conchords from New Zealand about the humans are dead, but the robots have killed the humans. So is there any ethical concerns about this AI coming true through Flight of the Conchords songs?
I don't think so. Certainly not now. Yeah. I don't really know where to go with that one. I will reiterate though, a lot of these sort of long AI conversations that people are posting on the web. And if you read it with the eye on of what fiction might have prompted this response, given especially the conversation history, you can see it drawing from things like movie plots and novels and science fiction tropes and all sorts of kinds of things. And you've got to remember that it's not thinking, it's not being creative, it's just generating sequences of words that are like what it's seen before, given the prompt that it gave you. So when you think about what it's trained on, some of those responses that you see kind of make a little bit more sense.
Well, a good writer borrows, a great writer steals.
Yes, and that's what's happening.
Yes, that's what's happening. Cool. Good. What'd you say?
I was going to say, I think steals is the wrong word here because it's kind of like what we do in our own creative process. We're influenced by the literature we read and the interactions that we have, and there's some amalgamation of that is in our output. And in some sense, and again, not to anthropomorphize these things, but it's really an amalgamation. What's the word I'm looking for? A mix-up of all the stuff that's been trained on conditioned on the prompt that you gave it.
Right. That's why humans do things. Like you're not writing, Springsteen, you just sound hints of Dylan in him and hints of Woody Guthrie within Dylan. So yeah, so people amalgamate things.
There's a long philosophical debate that we get to have had here over many beers.
Yes, and it's fortunate we're not at Rye House, which doesn't exist anymore. But we're not at some bar near the meetup having a conversation about this.
Yeah.
Dave will just have to fly out to the East Coast for one of the other meetups and come and join us at the bar.
Yeah.
Anything to get people over here to New York City. So let's see. There is a question about, actually, there was a follow-up to that. Let me just see where it went. Where does this go? Oh, can you tell Copilot, no, I don't like that, try again?
I believe you can. I think there's even a keystroke for it. I actually never use it, though. I've seen people use it. What I tend to do is just modify. If I get something that doesn't look like what I write, I either try and modify the context, the prompt I gave it, the previous comment or the previous line of code, or give it a little bit more guidance with the start of the code. And you saw me do that when I asked it for an analysis of variance and used the ANOVA function, which I don't like. I like the traditional AOV function. So I just started writing the code like I wanted to see, and then I kind of got the gist of it and followed on from there. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, I found that interesting.
Yeah.
When you deleted it or ignored what it wanted and you started typing, I don't think you even typed in AOV. You just started model gets. So did that mean when you wrote that line of code, it had the context of the comment above it also?
Oh, yeah. It is not just the previous few characters or lines. It actually has the context of most of the file, I think. I'm not sure the details exactly what it gets sent, but it has a lot of context. And often surprising what it picks up on.
So that's a nice segue into another question we had here. When stuff's being sent over, how long is that stored for? How long is it shared? Like, what's the privacy implications of your prompts, which is your code going over there?
Yeah. So if you're in a company, you're working on proprietary code, that code snippets of it is obviously sent to the Copilot server for the purpose of generating the prompts, but after that, they're discarded.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it discarded like right after the prompt is done?
Yeah, right after the session, yeah.
Okay, that's a quick deletion. All right.
Yeah, and all the details of that are on there. There's a link that I provided in the show notes about some of the policies, and all the details are in there. Okay.
Cool. I think there's a bunch of questions here about proprietary confidential information, stuff like that.
Yep. Microsoft is obviously very sensitive to that. Microsoft's business is working with commercial companies, and so it's been designed with all of that in mind.
Are there any concerns about the license implication? I know this is talked about a lot, so I'm also giving you a non-softball about the licenses of the open source code on GitHub that's being used, and whether or not scanning someone's code is what are the implications of that? Because I have a feeling from what you've already said, I have to answer, but where have you seen the conversations go about, hey, you use my code as a training data? I didn't say you could do that.
Yeah, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't sort of really answer this kind of in detail. What I would point folks to is there's a series of FAQs on the GitHub website around Copilot. I put a special link directly in the show notes about that addresses a lot of those questions. Does Copilot generate code that exists in its training data? And the answer to that is most of the time, no. But there are some examples that people have seen where it generates, a few hundred characters that are verbatim. Yeah, they're verbatim of some other characters, some other code. And that generally happens either because, that idiom is represented in lots of code across the web, so it becomes the most likely completion in that particular case. Or sometimes it just might be the only solution. There's lots of places in programming where there's just one way to do it, or that anybody does it. And obviously it's going to generate it in that case. There is an option in GitHub Copilot. It's designed for exactly this situation where people in commercial companies just don't want there to be any chance of anything representing stuff that existed in the open source database that it was trained on. And so it will automatically detect if code that it generates is represented in the training corpus, actually anything in GitHub, and will automatically not generate it for you.
Okay.
Then I have a slide, I think at the end of my deck, I can probably pop that up, which kind of shows you how to do that.
When this first came out, I remember seeing screen caps of someone asking for the fast inverse square root. It was like verbatim, the famous Doom code, including all the profanities in the comments.
Right. Yeah. That was one of the examples that kind of prompted this.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a fun thing to watch, though. Let me tell you, it's
Yeah.
very fun to watch.
But I certainly will reiterate to anybody out there that kind of has any questions about, these issues around code completion and licensing and so forth. Reach out to me. I'd love to chat with you and kind of hear about kind of what those concerns are in your particular situation. And I can relay them back to the GitHub team. I don't work at GitHub. I work at Microsoft, but obviously we work closely together. And a lot of the slides, in fact, came from some of my friends over in the GitHub team here.
So talking about code completions, when you were doing a code completion of the path to the file, or even code completing a function name,
Yeah.
and IntelliSense has been around for a while. So what was going on there? Was like an old-fashioned IntelliSense, or was every code completion was that Copilot?
Yeah. Every completion you saw in that demo was Copilot. I actually spent a lot of time figuring out how to turn off all of the IntelliSense and automatic function header help and all that kind of stuff, because it got really confusing about what was Copilot and wasn't. But everything you saw in that demo was Copilot.
Okay.
Yeah.
That actually prompts another question that I had up here is, do you have your VS Code config for using R and using Copilot somewhere public and we can see them and borrow from?
Yeah, it's in the notes for the meeting. I actually don't do a lot of configuration for that, but I did include some demo setup instructions in there that show what extensions to install in Visual Studio Code and what R packages I used to make those demos work. But it's pretty vanilla, everything that I used.
Okay. And do you actually even include turning off IntelliSense and that other stuff?
I do actually, yeah, because I wanted those notes for myself for next time I have to do this demo.
Nice.
Yeah.
Because we had to talk a couple years ago from the person, Kun Ren, who created the R extension for VS Code.
Yep.
And even still, I'm like, I need to see config files because VS Code is, if you really want to make it feel like RStudio, it takes a lot of configuration.
Yeah, I confess I haven't actually done a lot of R programming in a few months, and so coming back to it, that R extension has come a long way. It is much easier to install, and it is super powerful. So I was very impressed with how far that had come along.
Nice, yeah. I'm not sure if he's the only one working on it still, or if Microsoft's helping out, but it's really great.
Yeah, I was checking out the GitHub repo, and it's been very active. So I think there's quite a few people working on it.
Nice, good. For those of you that don't know, it's a VS Code extension to make working of R and R Markdown very easy. You can check if you go to nyhackr.org and search for VS Code or search for Ken Roon. You'll see you can find the talk he gave a few years ago. It's a whole thing that lets you use the VS Code like you just saw David using. It's really nice. So back to some questions then. When you hit the model API directly, and set the parameters to select the most probable result, can you set a seed for deterministic outcomes?
No, I don't believe you can set a seed. You do have some control over which token is selected. And I believe if you set the temperature parameter to 0, it will always select the most likely or the highest probability token. I haven't played around with that enough to know if that's completely deterministic. Like, I don't know what happens if there's multiple tokens that have the same probability. But that might be something to try. I haven't tried it myself though.
Okay. So then how does Copilot handle complex or nuanced coding tasks such as debugging or optimization?
That is a big question. How does that handle? I think I haven't sort of gotten into that into depth, to be quite honest. I write demo code, so I'm in the luxury position of never having to debug it or write tests for it. But I know other people that have. And I've certainly heard that people find Copilot very valuable for generating tests in all sorts of languages. So that's obviously something that helps with the debugging process, is generating those tests and using that as part of your debugging process. When it comes to the more complex things, I'm not exactly sure, to be honest, but if anybody has experience with that would like to chime in, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. So I was just thinking, can we use either Copilot or ChatGPT to generate a prompt for Copilot or ChatGPT?
That gets us into another long beer conversation about what happens when these models, they're not trained in this situation. It's more about the prompt generation. But I will tell you that for the next generation of models that are being developed, both of ChatGPT and of Codex, care is being taken actually not to include AI generated content in that training set to avoid that very feedback loop.
Yep. Yeah, you don't want to use there's that even the statistical thing. You don't want an ancestral model.
Yeah.
Yep. So someone actually asked, nice segue, what do you think about what new features do you think are coming, or what capabilities do you anticipate?
I would point you to a certain slide. Let me show you slides, because I think I have one right at the end here. There we go. If you go to githubnext.com, you can see lots of new features that are coming for Copilot. One thing that looks super cool that I haven't played around with a lot yet is something called GitHub Labs. So you can open up a little pane next to your code, highlight a chunk of code or a function or whatever, and then it will tell you in English what that code does.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that seems super cool and useful. That's in labs right now, so that's actually available to anybody who has GitHub if you install that new extension. And there's lots of very new cool things coming as well. They're coming up with a version of Copilot for the shell prompt, so that while you're shell programming or just typing shell commands, it will suggest things in that. Lots of other stuff as well.
I would like to see this go cyclical. Take code, translate it to human, and take the human as a prompt to generate new code.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to see that. Okay, so then there's just a few comments going on in the chat about there's a package called dtplyr, which is for combining dplyr data table, but someone else is saying that tidytable does an even better job than dtplyr does. So there's lots of cool things going back to our data table discussion earlier.
Okay.
One more question, then we'll do a few giveaways, then we'll come back and maybe another question. You described it as a blurry JPEG of the internet. Would you also maybe consider it a GIF of the internet?
No, because a GIF is not lossy, I believe.
I mean, like an animated GIF, but you're right.
Oh, all right, okay. Is this a joke question or a serious question?
A joke question.
I can't tell by the context. It's a joke question. All right, yeah. Yeah.
Got to throw some of those in there.
Yeah.
But I like how you thought about the lossy thing. I like that. Yep. All right, so we'll see if there's anything left about for questions. Then if I ask them all, so if there's not, then I'll end this thing by talking about when I first introduced David, I said that he's been using R since before it was called R. Now, I did not come up with that. I saw him tweet that once as a joke himself, but it's also true because David has been using R for so long. He used it back when it was called S. For those of you that don't know, because there's people in this community who are new to R, who are old to R is derived from a language called S, invented at Bell Labs by John Chambers, 1974. Did I get that year right, David? Do you know?
Yeah, 73, 74. Yep.
73, 74. It was invented then at Bell Labs by John Chambers, and this is a breakthrough language. And it didn't become R. It never became R, but R didn't become a thing until the 90s. I want to say 97, when two professors out of New Zealand went and created R. And then over time, there's a whole shift over there, including David, who made his way from S into R. So if you're ever wondering why we have S3 and S4 objects, it's because of S. So, and David wrote one of the first plugins for an IDE, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning, Emacs Speak Statistics, which allowed you to use it in Emacs. I've never once used Emacs in my life, just like David's only ever once used VI. You can see how revolutionary that was. So if for nothing else, let's give David a huge applause for writing that and for speaking at our meetup. And you're not going to hear the applause, they're all going to be in emojis. But thank you, David, for your continuing contributions to S/R.
Thank you, Jared. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. This was a really fun talk to put together. You're all the first to see this. This is the very first time I've given this talk, but I hope I'll get to give it again. So thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you for being here. It's always a great chance to chat with you. I'm glad everyone else could learn all this great stuff from you. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.